Great. Well, I think we might as well get started here, and as folks join in, shouldn't interrupt us at all. So welcome everyone. My name is Zena Wolcott. I work for Friends of the Teton River as the Community Outreach Coordinator. Thank you all for joining us today. We have Amy Verbeten, Executive Director of Friends of the Teton River, and Lynn Bagley, President of the Teton Soil Conservation District, joining us today to talk about Aquifer Recharge in Teton Valley. Let's see, so a couple of things as we get going here. I cannot see you all, we cannot see you all or hear you all right now as participants. So we won't hear kids in the background, dogs, any of that for now. We will roll into some questions that we receive via email. And then after that, we'll open it up to discussion where you can then participate in the conversation. But for now, we can't hear you, we can't see you. While we're going through questions that we received via email, feel free to participate using the chat feature. So you can just type a question in and I'll screen that and sort of filter it onto Amy or Lynn as we're talking. And I'll try to, if you have a question about something that we're talking about, I'll make sure to get it in there while we're talking about that subject so it makes sense. And then afterwards, as I mentioned, you'll have an opportunity to ask for more information if that's what you're looking for. This is our first time doing a Zoom webinar, so we'll just ask you all for your patience, and we hope that it goes smoothly and you all can hear us perfectly the entire time. And if that doesn't happen, bear with us, we'll figure it out. So perfect. So to start, we are going to show the Aquifer Recharge video that we made last year with a bunch of irrigators. If you've already seen this video, you can make a cup of tea, grab something to drink, and come back. It's about 7 minutes long. And we think it really gives a great overview of the Aquifer Recharge program here in Teton Valley and provides some really good visuals for it. So we'll start with that. And then after that, we'll roll into some questions that we received via email, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And then as you are listening, feel free to type in those questions in the chat. And I think that's it. Maybe before we start the video, Amy and Lynn, would you mind actually just both introducing yourselves, who you are, a little bit about yourself, so that people have some context for your face?
Sure. I'm Amy Verbeten. I'm the Executive Director for Friends of the Teton River. And I've been working with the Teton Water Users Association, which is the group that was formed to really do this Aquifer Recharge project. We actually came up with the idea together. That was about 5 years ago that we really started working on this project, and I feel really fortunate to get to be a part of it. We'll talk a little bit more about Friends of the Teton River's role and why we're interested in this project later, but that's me. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Lynn.
Thanks, Amy. So my name's Lynn Bagley. Long-time resident. So I was born and raised in Teton Valley. My ancestors helped settle Teton Valley. So I've been here for, my family's been here for a long time. So I live in the Victor area. I've been a farmer. I was a dairy farmer for a long time. We sold cows a few years ago. So I have a farm that I do here. I raise a lot of hay. And then I also have a yard maintenance business over in Jackson. I'm on the Trail Creek Irrigation Board, and so water is very, very important to us, and water rights are very important to us as an ag community. So this is how I kind of got involved with Amy and moving forward with this program.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Amy. Perfect. So what we'll do, I'll start up that video. Let me know if you can't hear or see. This worked perfectly yesterday, but we'll see how it goes today.
It's the most beautiful place in the world. We have everything that we need to make a good, easygoing, peaceful, as well as productive life here in the valley.
I'm outfitter and guide for Teton Valley Lodge, and grew up here on this spot in Teton Valley. Well, the Teton River, to me personally and to our family, it means a tremendous amount. There's just something special about it. It's just a magic place. So you can go all over the world and catch great fish, big fish, maybe even bigger fish than here. But to have day in and day out the dry fly fishing you have on this river, there's very few places in the world that have that. So it's really special.
I'm the fourth generation here from my family, and we have been farming ever since. My great-grandma was born here in the valley. We've raised beef cattle my whole life. The land and the Teton River is basically the life source of what I do. Without the land, the water, the river, I can't exist.
I love the family life of it. I think this is where we were supposed to be and what we were supposed to be doing. And it's a huge benefit to me to be able to carry on that legacy that my great-grandpa started. I mean, we've been farming potatoes in this valley for almost 100 years, and that it just it makes me feel proud and gives me purpose.
The water is the lifeblood of the valley. You know, whether you moved here to be a fisherman, whether you moved here just for the tourist aspects, just for the snowpack, you know, so you go skiing or snowmobiling. Everybody that moves here, they all drill a well, they all love the clean water they can pull out of the ground. Without water, without clean water, my farm would dry up, my crops wouldn't grow. So the protection of the water is the biggest thing that needs to happen in our valley.
In my lifetime, so there's been quite a few changes in the river and to the valley, Teton Valley, you know. Land uses are different and attitudes, demographic. There's a lot more pressure, you know, a lot more people and different types of recreation.
Some of our biggest concerns at this point, rising temperatures and declining flows, in some cases even causing fish fatalities. At the same time, we're also seeing our aquifer that all of us depend on in this valley for drinking water, we're seeing that decline. We've heard reports of individual private wells going dry. People don't have drinking water anymore. One of the other threats that we're facing is that as we see more and more development pressure, we're losing agricultural land rapidly. When we lose agriculture, we lose the ability to intentionally manage water.
Teton Valley has this unique underground reservoir that's natural to the area. There's a lot more water being taken out of it right now. So we have to be able to figure out how to put that water back in there.
With the old irrigation practices, lots of that water was stored, and so these wetlands were great habitat for birds and for terrestrial animals between the farmland and the river. And since all the pipelines went in, the locals have noticed these wetlands have begun to get drier earlier in the season. And this is an effort then to restore the flow to those wetlands, keep them wetter, greener longer in the year.
We need to sink that water up here in the highlands, you know, as close to the mountains as we can, because then it takes longer to get out of the valley. Disperse that big stream flow that's coming out in the spring, disperse it out, slow it down, and then it's there for everybody. I mean, even as far away as Washington and the salmon. If those of us in the highlands can make it happen and put water into the ground, it's going to help all of us all the way down.
This valley, without the ability to manage water the way that family farmers and ranchers have done for generations, would look really different. We would take a huge economic hit. People come here because they love this river. If we lose that, we lose a significant portion of our economy. We lose a lot of what most of us came here for. Through this Aquifer Recharge project, we can set that time clock back a little bit. We can recharge that underground reservoir and allow that water to slowly trickle out from the ground into the river, into our creeks at the time when it's needed most for agriculture and for fish.
With the ability to have FTR bring all the science into what us farmers want to do, plus be able to supply the manpower to do it during the summer when we need to do it, it's a win-win for everybody.
I can see now, like, gathering the data and figuring it out has brought a lot of benefit to the projects that are happening now and have been happening. And the proof's in the pudding. You see the numbers of the fish and the quality of the hatches on the river and the quality of the water, and it's, there's no denying it. It's working.
The Friends of the Teton River have been a very crucial asset for the whole recharge programs. We have a common goal. A common goal is water.
Environmentalists and farmers are actually working together. That's something that usually doesn't happen. We need to be kind and, embrace differences, change, all that kind of stuff. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Let's make it happen correctly, and let's write our own destiny.
Perfect. So we hope that was a good overview to get us started in this conversation today. So just to kick us off, Amy, would you mind just giving us a quick sort of what is Aquifer Recharge and what does it look like here in Teton Valley?
Yeah, thanks, Senna. Aquifer Recharge, it's basically using the underlying geology of our valley and the fact that it can hold water, and then we're intentionally putting water into that aquifer at a specific time. So underneath our feet here in our valley, our aquifer is made up of just a big, giant pile of sand and gravel and rock that was all left behind by the most recent periods of glaciation. It's just a bunch of unconsolidated sediment, and because of that, it's got a whole bunch of little spaces in between all those pieces of gravel, all those pieces of broken up rock, all that sand. And those spaces in between the gravel, the rock, the sand can hold water. So in the springtime, when there's lots of water melting down out of the Tetons, the Snake River Range, the big holes, if we can intentionally take that water out, a little bit of that water out of the creeks and spread it out over the ground, then that water can actually seep into all of those spaces and begin to fill up that underground reservoir. And it just so happens that there's a really neat relationship. That water slowly then trickles sort of downhill toward the Teton River. And it takes about 3 months from the time that that water begins to be diverted during the snow melt. So farmers and ranchers are diverting right when the water starts to come up in April, May, June, when the water's high. It takes about 3 months for that water that's been stored in the aquifer to then really start making its way out into the wetlands in the Teton River itself. So that water begins to really flow out in the main stem river in July, August, and September, during the months when it would normally be lower water and warmer water. So it's really the act of these farmers and ranchers diverting water out of the creeks, spreading that water out on the ground through canals, flood irrigation, and in other ways of just basically putting water out. That water seeps into the spaces and then trickles underground and wells up again in the Teton River about 3 months later.
Great, thanks, Amy. And Lynn, so what does that look like on the ground? Sort of if you're out there irrigating, how does it actually get done? How does recharge? Sometimes we refer to it either interchangeably as Aquifer Recharge or just recharge, but what does that look like when you're out there?
So originally, when this valley was settled, here in the Victor area, most of the water came out of Moose Creek and Game Creek. That's our two main water sources. As it came down, what we know as Trail Creek, there was a series of canals that diverted the water through head gates and diversions. One of the big main ones runs across the mountain right along the Victor Cemetery, familiar with that, and then runs down through and waters all that upper ground, like next to Hill. And then as the Trail Creek come on down to 5 more canals. So each property had a canal that ran through their property, and then they would divert out of that canal into little irrigation ditches, and then they would flood it out over their hay fields or the grain fields or whatever it may be. Even the city of Victor, I remember when I was growing up, the people in the city of Victor watered their lawn through flooding. So that's why Victor had a lot of old ditches ran through the city of Victor, and that's how people watered the lawn. And all that water would basically sink in the ground. And then, like Amy said, later on in the year, then all those springs down close to the river would start to run a lot more water, and that would keep the water flowing in the river in the late season. And so the whole key to the recharge is for us to use the water or put it out on the ground early in the season, let it sink into the ground, and then have it spring up later in the fall when typically we're really short, and when the Teton River is really short, then we have that water that we put out is now coming up later in the season. So we use it, and then the whole key is it springs up again, and then the downwater users, they get to use it again also. The main key to all this is once this water leaves the valley, it does not come back. And so if we can use it and to our benefit, then the lower water use, they get to use it too. And it's better for late season is always better because that's when we're typically short. So if we can hold it here, it's just like a reservoir. It's an underground reservoir that comes in August and September when we all need it.
Great, thanks, Lynn. For folks on the webinar, can you hear Lynn okay, or Amy, is it? I'm having a little bit of a hard time, and I didn't know if it was just me or if it was maybe Lynn. It might be, Lynn, maybe if you just sit a little bit closer when you're talking. You don't have to be like, mouth right in the microphone there, but maybe a little bit closer, we might be able to hear a little bit better. Or you have to get a headset like Amy's. Those are our options.
Okay. I'll set
great, thanks. Yeah, great. So it sounds like it's a little bit hard to hear. So when you're talking, Lynn, maybe just, a little bit closer will help. We'll see. It's worth trying at least.
Okay.
Thanks. And so Lynn, how did the Aquifer Recharge program get started? What was the motivation behind it? And sort of who were the key players in getting this program off the ground?
Well, first of all, there's been several of us farmers that have been interested in that, because what we've seen happen is that as we became better farmers, we all converted to sprinkler irrigations. And so Trail Creek Irrigation back in the early 1970s put in a huge irrigation system. And when that first went in, that was great, because now we cut 2 crops of hay where we used to cut one crop of hay. But in doing that, we started to notice that our little springs down next to the river were starting to dry up. I remember out from our dairy barn, where we used to have the cows out there was little, I call them swamp holes, and you couldn't ride a horse through it. You had to get off and walk through it. And if you was to go out there right now, you could actually drive a vehicle through them because they've dried up. And so that's how the idea came about is, gosh, we became better farmers, and we let the water run down the river so it left the valley. And now we're finding out, oh, we need to go back and fix that a little bit. We need to put some of that water back in the ground like we used to when we were flood irrigating. So the farmers we picked up on that, what was happening. And then I got to know Amy a long time ago. And so Amy and I became very good friends, and we got talking about it, and I've had lots of discussions with her. And so with that, we kind of got together and brainstormed and talked things. We didn't always agree, we'll have to admit that, but we had to talk things out. And we found out we had a lot more in common than we really realized. We had more in common than what we disagreed on. And it's always good to start with the things that you have in common, because then the other things tend to go away. Yeah. And so we started working with them, and that's really how this all started to come about.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Amy, what is FTR's interest and involvement in this project? How come FTR is involved?
Well, partially because Lynn just kept chewing my ear off about how important recharge was. In all seriousness, I think from the time I started here at Friends of the Teton River back in the early 2000s, I really started hearing from these farmers and ranchers that they'd been really successful in conserving water in their operations, but that had changed the way that water flowed in our valley. It changed then the way that water flowed in our creeks and in our river. And so I kept hearing folks like Lynn and other folks who were farming and ranching in this area talking about how much the flow in the river had changed, how much the temperature had changed, and them talking about how they felt like we needed to go back to doing some kind of intentional aquifer recharge. During that same period, the mission of Friends of the Teton River is to protect clean water, healthy streams, and a thriving wild fishery. So during that time, we were doing a lot of research on the fishery itself. We were doing research on water quality, including water temperature. And we were definitely seeing a trend of decreasing flows and rising temperature in the creeks and in the Teton River itself. And so what we were hearing from these farmers and ranchers was being confirmed by the data that we were collecting. We were also starting to hear these anecdotal reports of people, residents of our valley, whose their well water was changing. In some cases, we heard some reports of somewhere upwards of 10 private wells that had actually gone dry. They were too shallow. When the aquifer began dropping, it dropped down below the bottom of that well. So we were hearing all of these things come together at the same time that farmers and ranchers were saying, yeah, things have changed. The way water flows has changed. We were observing changes in the wetlands down by the Teton River. Folks who monitor birds and mammals were telling us that wetland habitat was decreasing. So all of these stories as well as data was starting to point to these significant changes in the river, in the way that water was flowing. And so we began to get together with farmers and ranchers talking about this. Around the same time, the Henry's Fork Foundation, Dr. Rob Van Kirk, had been really collecting data and really carefully analyzing data on changes in flow all across the Henry's Fork. The Teton is a sub-watershed within the Henry's Fork watershed. And so Rob was studying all this that we had been observing, and he was able to really quantify a relationship between the conversion over to highly conservative sprinkler irrigation and this decline in river flows throughout the Henry's Fork watershed. So all of those things came together. We were able to get the numbers to really show us in real time what farmers and ranchers had been observing over the past 40 or so years. And then we all sat down together and said, okay, well, what do we actually do about it? How do we actually go about solving this problem? Zena, I think you're on mute.
I am. We're doing so well until then. Lynn, you touched on this a little bit, but how come farmers and ranchers locally here in Teton Valley are interested and invested in Aquifer Recharge?
Okay, there's a couple of main reasons. First of all, water in the state of Idaho is all controlled. There's senior water rights and there's junior water rights. Here in Teton Valley, we have all junior water rights. And so back in the day when we were all flood irrigating, in fact, if you take the state of Idaho as a whole, there was a lot of flood irrigation going on. And so our aquifers all over the state were very high and we had a lot of water. Now we all go to sprinkler irrigation, and like I said, when the water leaves Teton Valley, it doesn't come back. And we found that throughout the state of Idaho. So we have junior water rights. And so when we hit certain priority dates, and I believe 1896 is probably our earliest water right for Trail Creek irrigation. Once those priority dates drop below that, then we have two choices: either buy more water or shut the irrigation system down. And so our feeling and contention is if we can increase those stream flows later in the fall, hopefully we can have our cutoff date a little bit longer in the season. And so that's the main reason why we're getting involved, is because of our junior water rights, and we need the water in order to harvest our crops in late season, to get the grain crops that last watering they need to be able to cut that second crop of hay. And so our whole philosophy is, if we can send more water out later in the fall like we used to, that we can hang on to those priority dates, so they will stay higher later in the season, so we don't have to buy water or do something else. But that's typically what we do. And we can get into the feudal call and all that kind of stuff, which we probably will before this is over with. But that's the nutshell. We need the water in late season too.
And Lynn, a question that sort of just came in was, how does this impact folks downstream of us? What will it impact people downstream who also are water users that are dependent on water coming out of the Teton?
Our recharge is done early in the season before the priority dates come on board. So we have a window where we can do recharge, and it's typically in the spring when the snow first melts and starts to leave. And if you've been in this valley at all, you know we get into first part of June to the middle of June. The Teton River is running full bore. Trail Creek is running like crazy. And so that's the window that we have to recharge when there's no priority date on. And the key is the American Falls Reservoir is full and the Palisades Reservoir is full. And by doing that early in the season, then we really not are going to impact them hardly at all, if any, because then we're going to hold that water, but we're going to send it to them in late season when they're typically short on water anyway. And so that's the whole key of, they're still going to get it. It's just not going to get it in May or June, because there's plenty of water for them then. It's in August is when they get short food. So if we can send more to them in August, they're going to benefit just as much as we are.
Great. And so if this if that question, you know, if that answer didn't answer your question fully, afterwards, hang on, we'll open it up for dialogue in the discussion. And so this is a question for both Amy and Lynn. Maybe Amy, if you want to go first. If you're not an irrigator, if you're not a farmer rancher, or somebody that maybe benefits directly from the Teton River as being a fishing guide, will this program benefit you, or how or not?
Yeah, great questions. And I'm actually going to share my screen. I've got a little diagram that I think can really help to understand how exactly this works. So this was a diagram that was put together by a graduate student, actually, for us to help explain a little bit about Aquifer Recharge and why it's important to everyone in this valley. So just really basically, if you can see where my cursor is pointing, as snow accumulates all through the winter months up here in our high mountains, the Tetons and the other surrounding mountains. And then as it starts to warm up, which hopefully it will do here soon, as it starts to warm up, April, May, June, that snow will start to melt and it begins to flow down our mountain streams and into our creeks. The canals divert water out of those creeks and into these, I mean, there's over 350 miles of canals throughout the whole Henry's Fork watershed. And then that water is further spread out on farms and into irrigated agriculture. As all of that happens, there is a tremendous amount, you can see this seepage, there's a tremendous amount of seepage. Those canals are just dug, again, into that glacial sediment, and the water seeps out of them as it flows along. As water is spread out on irrigated lawns, on irrigated agricultural fields, it just simply sinks down into the water, or into the groundwater, into the aquifer. And then all those of us in this valley who drink water, which I'm assuming is everyone, or use water in any way, shape, or form, we get that water out of the ground. So all of our valley's drinking water comes from either domestic or municipal city wells. So as aquifer levels have declined, that has impacted those domestic and residential wells. As I said before, some have even gone dry. That's obviously an extreme case. For those that haven't, as the aquifer declines, you have to spend more money on electricity trying to pump that water out from further down underground. Everybody who enjoys the river experiences the lower flows in the late summer when aquifer recharge hasn't happened. We've heard, lots of stories of people saying, gosh, I never remember having to get out of my raft and drag my boat down the river until these last 10 years or so. And so folks have been noticing that. Our wetlands that support wildlife, as aquifer levels have declined, we don't have that water seeping into our wetlands anymore. That has impacted wildlife. And so by diverting some of that water in the very early spring, spreading it out through flood irrigation in April, May, June, spreading it out through canals, that water seeps in, fills up that aquifer more, and then we get more water in our creeks and in our river in July, August, and September. I think the other thing that's important to realize is that in July, August, and September, these agricultural producers are switching over to their highly conservative methods. So by the time July, August, September rolls around and water is low in the creeks and in the river, they are not flood irrigating anymore at that time. They are going over to those really conservative methods of sprinkler irrigation that work really well for saving water. And so it's a nuance, it's a timing related issue. So we flood irrigate, we run as much water as we can when there's a lot of water to be had, when nobody's using it really for most irrigation, it's spilling over our reservoirs. And then in the late summer when water is scarce and everyone needs it, they go to their most conservative methods of water use. I think that may have answered a couple of the questions that came up also. So I didn't just answer your question, then I was trying to answer a couple of the others. I think you're on mute, Zena.
Yeah, shows that'll happen again. So, and then a question is, a couple of questions that came in specifically relating to flood irrigating and how it works. So Lynn, a couple of questions for you. One, can you flood irrigate annual crops, or what is that? What is the ideal land for flood irrigating? And does the infrastructure exist right now for farmers and ranchers to flood irrigate?
In certain cases, yes, some of that infrastructure is still there. Obviously, it's not like it used to. So our key to recharge right now is going to be running as much water down the canals as we can, and letting it just seep in the ground as it runs down, because you're going to lose 40 to 50% of the water going down the canals to actually just seep in the ground as it goes down through. That's going to be our main source. There are some gravel pits and things that we can run some water. There is still some options in certain areas to do some flood irrigating, but that's one of our problems, is that we have lost some of that key infrastructure, and so we do need to do some more canal maintenance. We have a lot of canals now that have run through subdivisions, and people are starting to get on board and realize that, gosh, that canal is pretty important to have water down there. And those who have property along the canal have now figured out that just having that water there adds value to their property. And so they're starting to get on board. Some of the problems that we've had with the canals, though, is everybody wants their little private pond right next to their house. And so they put little rock dams in the canal, which can create some other problems with flooding. So our biggest concern is, we want to run as much water as we can, but not flood anybody. And so we're not going to go back like we used to, but if we can get back as close as we can, that's going to benefit us all.
And Lynn, can annual crops be flood irrigated?
Some of them can, but typically, so we got to go back to what Amy said about when water starts getting low and we have priority date, then we got to go to our most conservative method of saving the water. And so once we start into priority dates, all the canals are totally shut off and everything is run through the sprinkler system. So to say we can flood all year long, that's really not going to happen. Other than a few people, if you watch that video, you saw pictures of James Dewey flood irrigating. He does that in the summertime, but he doesn't get that water till late season because that property is right down next to the river, and so it's some of those canals running early in the season that springs up later that allows him to water those pasture fields down late in the season. So in certain areas, yeah, those hay fields are watered all through the season, but it has a lot to do with the recharge that's being done up above him early in the season.
I'll also just add that, I think Lynn and the other irrigators that are participating in this project, they are obviously the ones out there doing this work on the ground. And so a big part of our role has been to get out and find funding for this project. And so one of the things that we are doing is we're actively out there seeking funding to upgrade or restore infrastructure that has been damaged or lost, so that this project can continue to grow. We have been able to, just this year, we purchased some gated pipe for an irrigator high up on the Teton Creek system. This will be his first year using that, to actually getting that pipe out so he can effectively flood irrigate his alfalfa or his hay fields. So that's been a big part of our role. We're also really trying to work with the county, primarily the county, to make sure that we know where all of that irrigation infrastructure is, all of those canals, for example, that run across lots of properties, and ensuring that when folks build or otherwise develop land, that that canal infrastructure is retained. So, you know, the majority of this, the real work is being done by farmers and ranchers, but we're able to add some value by bringing in those additional resources, making sure that we're not further losing infrastructure and being able to replace some of the infrastructure that has been lost.
Great. And just maybe one more question here, Amy, for you before we switch it over to sort of allow for a little bit more of a discussion. But one thing a question that I often get is how will the success of Aquifer Recharge be monitored? Can it be monitored? If you wouldn't mind touching on that quickly.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's another big part of what conservation groups have been able to bring to this project. That work is actually primarily being done by the Henry's Fork Foundation, as well as we have a shared employee with the Henry's Fork Foundation, Bryce Contour. I believe he's actually on here. So hi, Bryce. Bryce and other folks from the Henry's Fork Foundation are doing a bunch of work. Bryce has been out monitoring wells that we have permission to monitor, and actually being able to measure depth to groundwater, and looking at how that's changing over time, and comparing that to longer term records of depth to water in those same wells. We also have a gauge out on the Teton River, way downstream, down by where Highway 33 crosses. It's called Harrop's Bridge here locally, for those of you who know that. And the Henry's Fork Foundation and some FTR employees installed a gauge down there, and we've been monitoring that, and we should be able to pick up on the changes that occur as a result of this active work to refill that aquifer. The really neat thing is that that gauge actually has been installed at the same location, or very similar location to where there used to be an old United States Geological Survey gauge. And so we have records that go back actually to like before the Trail Creek pipeline system was put in, and to before most of the really broad scale sprinkler irrigation happened. So we can compare the changes that we're making now to this long period of record, to be able to see how the work that we're doing is hopefully making a positive difference for the aquifer.
Great, thanks, Amy. And so now just to move into having some questions from you all as participants, and we have a couple in the chat. So maybe just to start, there's one from Leslie Stein. It says, have you run into any issues with state engineer's office in terms of reactivating the flood irrigation ditches early in the season? I'm not sure who that's a question that's best.
Well, I'll just touch on a little bit. As we go to the state as a whole, recharge is becoming a big deal. And so there's incidental recharge and managed recharge. There's a lot of big managed recharge things that are going on in the state of Idaho right now. We're going to do a little managed recharge in the Victor area this year. A lot of ours has been the incidental recharge. But, you know, people are catching on. We haven't had a lot of problems because it's statewide. They know what's happened. They've had a lot of wells been monitored in the Snake River Plain, and they've seen the drops there. And so they're trying to bring it back kind of like it used to be too. So statewide, it's a big thing, and we're going to hear more about it all the time.
And I'll just piggyback on what Lynn's saying. Declines in aquifers, local aquifers, and even regional aquifers is a huge issue throughout the West. And I think Idaho really has been one of the earliest to do broad-scale adoption of active aquifer recharge to address the issue, primarily utilizing some of these old non-technological practices. It's funny to be talking over Zoom about something that we're doing this recharge in this very low-tech way, and Idaho's really adopted that. And so they have been very willing to allow existing water rights to be used for this incidental recharge. And then we're now, for the first time this year, actually applying for some specific water rights to do managed recharge. And actually the irrigators doing that are being paid by the state, or will be paid by the state this year. But yeah, Idaho's addressing this in some really neat ways, but it's different in every state, and the laws in every state are different. And some places have really run into challenges doing this. In Idaho, well, we're fortunate to be supported by the state in these efforts for the most part.
Great. So folks on the webinar, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and then what I can do is I can unmute you, so you can ask that question either directly to Amy or Lynn or both of you. Or if that seems like too much, you're welcome to just type it in the chat, and I will sort of relay that message to Amy and or Lynn. So it looks like Doc, we've got a question from Doc. So Doc, I'm just going to unmute, and you're welcome to ask.
I may have hit the button. I'm fine.
Great.
We can hear you, Doc. Oh, okay. Got it.
Great.
Well, it's nice to hear your voice, Doc.
I was playing with the buttons and maybe I hit the wrong button.
Well, you raised your hand successfully. Great. So a question coming in on the chat, and it says, I know many of you have junior water rights, but how often are they actually called? Does this play a role in spring planting and decisions in low snowpack years? And so, Lynn, maybe you want to start off answering that.
Sure. They're called for almost every year. Like I said, we have our earliest water right is at 1896. So when those priority dates drop below that, then we have basically, well, for Trail Creek irrigation, we have two options. The first option is we have bought storage water out of Island Park. And so we exchange through the Crosscut Canal. They turn water out of Island Park, run it through the Crosscut Canal to the lower water users, and they allow us to use our existing water that we have up here. Now, if we get to a situation where we've used up all our storage water, then we either have to shut it off, or we get, if we can get the stream dry, a feudal call. And a feudal call basically means if we was to turn all the water down the stream, or back down the stream, so back down Trail Creek, and it does not reach live water, then they let us keep it. And so from a farmer standpoint, on years like that, we try to get a feudal call. If we can't get a feudal call and we have to buy storage water, that can be very expensive. Not too many years ago, we were buying, well, that particular year, we bought about $40,000 worth of storage water. So that gets expensive. So honestly, from a farmer's perspective, we really try to get a few call on those short water years.
And sort of, oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Let me just say, so people that don't have storage water, yeah, they have two options, really, to try and buy some or just to shut it off. And so it can become very crucial almost every year in the late season, you know, typically in August and in September.
Great. And so here, what I'm hearing you say is that maybe farmers and ranchers aren't, or farmers specifically, are not necessarily changing their planting based on the snowpack because of that ability to buy storage water. Is that right?
Well, we only have certain crops that we can grow. You know, basically, there's a few potato growers left. There's a few hay farmers. And there's some grain growers. So that's our basic crop right now. What may happen is that potatoes is one that takes a lot of water. That's why you don't see a lot of potato growers up here anymore for various reasons, but that's one of it. And typically, your hay crop, you may not get as good a second crop if you have to shut the water off, or your grain crop may not head out like it should and form the seeds like it should. So the kernels won't be as big or as heavy as they should be. So those are some of the things that we see when we have those short water years. But as far as really changing a lot of the crops we grow, we're pretty limited to what we can grow in the beginning. We don't change a lot.
Great. And so then a question that came in, it says, I've read some reports that putting water into the air, evaporation, is also a climate changer because of water vapor's ability to absorb sun energy. Might this change back to flood irrigation plus the temporary storage of water underground help relieve this problem also? Amy or Lynn, you want to take a stab at this?
Run that past us again. I didn't quite catch all that.
So I've read some reports that putting water into the air, or evaporation, is also a climate changer because of the water vapor's ability to absorb sun energy. Might this change back to flood irrigation, plus the temporary storage of water underground, help relieve this problem also?
I think that's a really interesting question. I can see it on the side of my screen here, and I read over it a couple of times, and that's not something that we've specifically considered in this. And, you know, I think it will be difficult or challenging to monitor that on a local basis, since those impacts would likely be at least regional, if not global. But I think that's a really interesting question as we start to see some of these practices expand. You know, I think there's a lot that farmers and ranchers are doing here to address some of the fundamental root causes of climatic change, including Lynn's leading a soil health initiative, for example, really increasing soil carbon, changing the way grazing is managed. And so, yeah, it's really neat to think that all of these efforts, and I thought of recharge as a adaptation strategy, but it could potentially even be a solution strategy as well. So yeah, really cool. I'd like to read a little bit more about that. Thanks, Brad, for putting that up there. I'll check that out a little bit more.
Yeah, let me just say, you know, we've talked a lot about recharge, but soil health is becoming a big issue, you know, and so now we're trying to figure out how do farmers in Teton Valley do cover crop? How do we make that happen? And so we're delving into that too. So this is an ongoing thing, kind of an exciting thing. And I planted a cover crop last year for the first time in my life. And it's going to be interesting to see if I can see any differences this year as I transition that back into a hay field. And then as I move other fields, doing cover crops there in that rotation. And another key piece to all this that's kind of interesting coming from a farmer's perspective is when we talk about soil health, cattle has become a very important key process in that whole soil health initiative. And so we run into a lot of people that don't like cows, but they like soil health. So there's a lot of education that's got to be go on as we move forward in all these avenues to make the valley better.
Great. So we have a question for Bill, and I'm wondering, Bill, if you want to ask it, because you may do a better job asking it than I do. You could just go ahead and type it if you do, and I can unmute you. All right, hang on, Bill. I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question to Amy and or Lynn. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Zena. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I was asking, I don't have a good idea about how much water this overall, this sort of plan or concept talks about taking out of the stream during the higher flows. My question was in regard to high flows. I think a lot of in-stream flow and environmental flow concerns often center around late summer low flows for temperature and habitat refugia regions, that kind of thing, and kind of keeping that life support alive in the streams late summer and fall. I think a lot more recently, people are paying attention to other portions of the hydrograph and really taking a look at those high flows in the spring and what they do for flushing flows in the gravels and spawning beds and macroinvertebrate habitat, as well as channel maintenance as far as maintaining your kind of stable hydraulic geometries and your actual overall river channel, your width and your depth, and, as well as kind of resetting like your riparian, habitat patchwork. And so in a lot of rivers are finding that shaving off more of the peak of the hydrograph, which makes sense for kind of water storage and water use, actually does have a lot of big impacts to stream systems. So that was kind of my question is, in Teton River Valley, have flushing flows and channel maintenance flows and kind of these other geomorphic flows been estimated for the stream or been studied? And is a plan like this or sort of an operational framework like this, is it, are those high flows being reduced enough to where you start to move into that territory of impacting your stream geomorphology? So it's a big question. I doubt there's an answer. I was just curious if that's on the minds.
Bill, thank you. It's great to hear your voice, Bill. It's a great question. And in all honesty, I think a big part of the reason that it took Friends of the Teton River so long to get on board with this project is because of our concerns about diminishing peak flow. It's long been thought that those peak flows have been, for a long time, we thought it was sort of the magic, the silver bullet to restoring Yellowstone cutthroat trout. But as we've collected more data over time and begin to better understand all of the impacts on Yellowstone cutthroat, we've realized that we probably have bigger problems when it comes to late summer flows, as well as non-native species interactions. But it's a question that we have. We work with an independent science review committee that's made up of a lot of fisheries biologists as well as geomorphologists, and they've sort of been tasked with telling us everything we're doing wrong with this project, and we set it up that way on purpose to really make sure that we are thinking about those factors. Those are going to be long-term decisions that are going to be made. We're going to have to collect, lots of years worth of data to make those kinds of calls. But we do have a plan in place for really trying to monitor that data and then use a feedback loop to adaptively manage this project based on those exact kind of questions. At this point, the amount of water that's being diverted early season is just a very small fraction of the overall runoff amount. And so, it's likely that the capacity of the canals will probably never be enough to really make a significant dent in that peak flow. But that said, it is something that we're keeping track of. I think our other perspective as well is that this recharge project, as Lynn said, without water, farms up here cannot continue to operate. And with changes in the state water management, that futile call situation that he referred to may go away. There's a lot of worry about that. And so by doing this, it's part of our explicit goal to ensure that we retain large tracts of land in agriculture and that we have the ability to actively manage water, intentionally manage water. We believe that if we have a lot of agricultural producers still operating on board with this project, if we find that we need a big flushing flow, we could come to an agreement to allow that if we have all those folks on board who are willing to work together to manage water. And so that's been a part of our thinking kind of from the beginning in this.
Let me just add a little bit from a farmer's perspective. If you've looked at the water right now, American Falls Reservoir is about full and Palisades is about full, and we have not started any of our spring runoff. And so they're going to have to turn some of that water down those streams. Once those reservoirs are full and once it goes across Milner Dam, that water leaves Idaho and it does not come back. And so if we can hold some of this water in the upper elevations, it's a win-win for the whole state of Idaho rather than having it leave the state. And so, like Amy mentioned, that little bit that we're going to hold up here is not going to be a huge impact. When I go back to my younger days and I see how some of the flooding took place in this valley in the early springtime, just having some of those canals that they could open up and run some of that water out of the main channels, it saved a lot of flooding back in some of the early days that I remember.
Great. So it's just a couple minutes after 1. So if you have to duck off, thank you all so much for joining us. Amy and Lynn, do you have time to keep answering a couple of questions if folks have them?
I certainly can. I see a question from Flint Hall,
Yeah.
One of our partners at Department of Environmental Quality that I'd love to answer. Yeah, a couple others on here that I'd be happy to answer for folks who are able to stick around.
Great. Lynn, do you have a minute?
Yeah, I can hang around for a little while too.
Okay.
It's too cold to work outside today. So.
Yes.
Great. And then if people want to give me a call later on, if they have other specific questions or things they'd like, I'd be more than happy to take a phone call from them too. So.
Perfect. What I can do is I'll pass on contact information for both you, Lynn, and Amy in the email that goes out in the next couple of days to all the participants. So you'll have that information if you do want to contact Lynn directly or Amy directly. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining. And we will keep answering some questions here for the next few minutes until, I guess, there aren't any more, or we decide that it's time. So Amy, a question coming in from Flint. Are there plans for more in-canal recharge, encouraging flood irrigation, or off-stream recharge, or a combination of these?
Yeah, so at this point, our plan is, so this past year, we were able to successfully recharge about 10,000 acre-feet of additional water into the stream. Our goal eventually is to get up to close to 30,000 feet of additional aquifer recharge. I am going to just share a little graph that shows that. And this is just a graph of sort of where we are, that black line, and what we expect the response in the Teton River to be, versus what our eventual goal is, if we can recharge 30,000 acre feet per year back to the Teton, what we expect the response in the Teton River to be. And again, these all came from Rob Van Kirk. And to do that, it's going to take a whole combination of strategies. So getting more water flowing into some of these canals that have not been used, doing more flood irrigation, and then using some specific areas. Lynn mentioned that there are some gravel pits that have been used historically every year during the irrigation season. And so just starting to use those a little bit more early in the season, filling those up with water, and doing more of sort of a managed recharge capability, or introducing more of that managed recharge capability. Getting back to that, that 30,000 acre feet will probably put us in a similar place to where Aquifer Recharge was about back in the mid-1970s. So this is not going all the way back to when flood irrigation was at its peak, but it would be, you know, similar to what flood irrigation, or I'm sorry, Aquifer Recharge looked like back about the time that the Trail Creek sprinkler irrigation system was installed. So it's not the full capacity of what could be done, but that's just not realistic anymore with how much land has been developed here.
Great, thanks. Any other questions out there from anyone on this webinar? Or anything? Oh yeah.
I did see a comment, just that, you know, in many ways, you know, this is obviously a very managed system. It's not necessarily the sort of the natural approach, but there was a comment that, you know, it's actually probably going back to the way this land used to look, you know, even before the settlers and pioneers came out here, when the whole river system and creek system had been dammed up and backed up by beavers. And so there was a lot of aquifer recharge happening there, big wetland systems. And so in some ways it's kind of mimicking some of that, even pre-settlement conditions. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting evolution of how we've used land and managed water over time.
Great. I'm not seeing any questions come in. Is there anything else additionally that Amy, you want to add, or Lynn, that you would want to add that we didn't talk about?
I think one thing I want to mention is the thing that's been making this work is everybody working together. There's not very many regions in Idaho or even the United States where you have a farmer group, and I'm going to call them an environmental group, working together. That doesn't happen very often. Okay, and then we got the cities that are on board and all the different groups. So it's not just one group trying to make this happen. Big group, and that's caught the eye of a lot of people around the country, of how we're all trying to work together for a common goal and a common theme to benefit all of us here in the valley. The other thing I might just add is, over the last couple of weeks, we've learned how critical agriculture is in having food in the grocery stores, and how critical the trucking industry is in having food in the grocery stores. And I don't know that a lot of people have realized how important the farming aspect is, because we've kind of got away from that. Everybody's grown up in cities now, and a lot of kids really don't know where that food comes from. It appears in the refrigerator. And so this has been good for us to get out of our comfort zone. It's been good for me to get out of my comfort zone I will say this, the first time that Amy invited me up to one of their meetings up at Grand Targhee, I felt like a fish out of water because I didn't know. I knew Amy and a couple of people, and that was difficult for me to do that. But now I know a lot of those people very, very well, and I'm just as comfortable going to those meetings now as anything I go to. And so it's been a real win-win for me to get involved in this and meet a lot of great people.
Thanks, Lynn. Anything, Amy, that you want to add before you wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, this clearly, there is, Friends of the Teton River could not do Aquifer Recharge by ourselves. I mean, it is, this can only be done because of the work that's being done by our agricultural water managers, our agricultural land managers. And it's a really unique partnership, and we're really fortunate to be part of that. I will also just give a shout out to the folks who have supported this project. Some of you are on the phone. We do rely on donations and grants. In order for us to be eligible for those grants, we have to bring private money to the table. And so a huge thanks to those of you who have supported this Aquifer Recharge program or our broader Farms and Fish program. We had hoped to do an event centered around this recharge program this spring, well, we're doing it now. So it looks different than we had intended, but we really appreciate all of you participating and supporting this program and these projects.
Great, thank you, Amy. Well, I think that's all that we have for today. I will send an email, as I mentioned earlier, to all of you, just with contact information for Lynn and Amy. So if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out to them directly. And I think that's it. Thank you all for participating. Really nice to see some familiar and new faces or names out there. And we look forward to holding an event at some point here in the future when we can all get together and continue these conversations. We'll let you know when that ends up being. But for the time being, thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.